Hi and welcome to this tutorial on manipulating the tonal range in your image. The tonal range in your image is also called the dynamic range of your image. It represents those brightness values right from black to white. So the dark areas are called shadows, the middle areas, the gray areas are called midtone, and the bright areas right up to white is called highlights. These values, tonal values, right from black to white, are represented by numbers, so 0 being black and 255 being white. 128 is middle gray. Digital color is represented by 3 channels of color, that is red, green and blue. And each of these channels of color can take values from 0 to 255, where 0 being the darkest shade and 255 being the brightest shade of that color. So if you take a look at this in Photoshop, you will see that when you input those values, you will get those colors accordingly. So for example, if you input 0, 0, 0 for R, G and B, you will get black. If you input 0, 0, 0, that is 0 for red, 0 for green and 0 for blue, you will get black. Similarly, if you put 255 for each, you will get white. If you put 255 for R, you will get red. Similarly, 255 for blue will give you blue. So if you want to make magenta, you will have to give it full red and full blue. So therefore 255 for R and 255 for blue. So similarly, you can make other colors by mixing these RGB values. Now, when these RGB values are the same, for example, 000 or 255, 255, 255, or 128, 128, 128, which represents middle gray. So whenever these RGB values are the same, it represents a gray value or a value between black and white. So the lower the number, the darker the shade, the higher the number, the brighter the shade. So for example, if you want a darker shade of gray, you would type something like 20, 20, 20. And if you want a slightly darker shade of white, not very white, but slightly white, then you would typically type something like 200, 200, 200. So this is how you can take a look at and manipulate different colors and different shades in your image. In order to find out what the values are for each of the pixels in your image, you have a tool in Photoshop which is called the Info panel. If you don't see the Info panel on your screen, you may want to go to the Windows menu in Photoshop and open up the Info panel from there. With the Info panel open, you can point to any area of your image and it will accordingly show you those values in the info panel as against R, G and B. So in this way you will be able to find out what the values are for a particular pixel in your image. So here is a black and white image and we have the histogram tab here, a panel, and this histogram basically is a representation of all the dark to bright values in the image. This image on the left hand side represents black and on the right hand side represents pure white. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of all these extra adjustments. So look at the histogram now, it's touching the left hand side. That means there is pure black, like in this case here. There is no pure white, so it's not touching the right hand side. If you see this exclamation mark on the histogram, it means that it needs to be updated. So you click on it and it gets updated. Now, whilst looking at the tonality or the range of blacks and whites in the image, this is mapped automatically for you in your histogram. And the height of the histogram in that particular area shows how much of that particular shade is available. To understand it better, let's take a look at a gradient from black to white. Okay. So as you can see, there are numerous shades of gray in between. And now if you look at the histogram, it has changed, where you have full white creeping on the right hand side and you have full black creeping on the left hand side. Okay. Now if I happen to move this slider out, making the blacks lighter, notice there's a gap now on that side there. If I take it further down, notice there's a bigger gap. Starting at the image here, you have no very dark shades of black. So if I bring in that again, notice how the histogram changes as I keep moving that. Okay. So basically your histogram is a representation of all the tonal values in your image. So let's bring it back to normal and let's take a look at the histogram once again. Okay. Now if we do the same thing on the other side, notice there's a gap on the right hand side because those areas of white are outside the image boundaries. Okay. So let's get back to normal again. So going back to the image now, or before we go there, I'll show you a trick or a tip that you can use to find out the tonality of any area of the image. Right now it's showing you the tonality or the tonal range of the entire image. So if you use the lasso tool and simply draw around the area that you want, it will show you where it appears on the histogram. Okay. So if I come to the extreme right and use that, you see it shows you the white area. Come to the extreme left, shows you the black area here. And if I take a broad range in between, then you get something like that, where it ignores the full blacks and it ignores the full whites. So as you can see, there's that gap there in the histogram. So let's go back to this image itself, and now the histogram is different because there is more black than there's more darker shades than lighter shades in this image. There is a tool in Photoshop called the threshold tool. So when you click on that tool, it shows you those particular values from 0 to 255 with a marker there. So this marker is indicating it's indicating tonal values within that range. So for example, if I bring it towards black, it's showing full white. That means and you can see right at the bottom here, you can see there are some black marks indicating that those areas are fully black. Okay. If I bring it to the extreme right and we look at our image, you see there are some areas here which it's showing which are fully white. Okay, now as we move it inside, away from the whites towards the gray, notice that it is showing areas of the image which are of that tonality. So you can use this effectively if you want to show those areas or work with those areas of your image. Okay. Now what do I mean by that? For example, let's say I want to add some color to these white areas of the image. Okay. So what I can do now is make a composite image from all this. So I get this on a separate layer. Okay. And I'm going to take a color layer, so solid color, and I'm going to use maybe a nice bright orange. And I want this to be the mask for this layer. So to do that, I come to the original layer which has the tonality. So we come to this layer, press Ctrl A for all, Ctrl C to copy, paste the image that I copied from the previous layer. So notice now that only that area has been painted in the color that I've chosen. And the good part of this is that now I can change it to any color I want. So you can use this threshold tool to see various tonal elements of this image. So let's get rid of these three layers. And this is my original image. Okay, so notice I have full black and full white. So for a picture to qualify as a black and white image, it should have full tones of white and full tones of black, which are slightly lacking here in this image. So I'm going to pull in the white point on the levels adjustment. And now notice that it starts climbing up on the right hand side, showing that there is areas of full white. You might want to be careful because when you go to print, those will come out as blank areas in your image. So similarly, if you bring in the blacks, you'll get an even more contrast. So this first slider here, which has three parts, the black point, the white point at the right hand side, and the middle point or the gray point. So if you want to designate a particular area as gray in your image, you have three droppers here, black, gray, and white. So if I want to force an area into white, what I can simply do is click on this white dropper and go to an area that I want fully white and click on it. Notice now that area has become fully white and the histogram has changed accordingly, and along with that it has made changes to the rest of the image so that it matches the output there. Similarly, you can have black, you can click, and now you have even more contrast because now you have two areas, one is white and one is black. So you have the full range of values or full range of tonal values in your image. Similarly, if you press the gray dropper, you could choose an area to be gray and it will adjust accordingly. Okay. Now, notice when you take a look at your histogram, this histogram is also represented here in the levels adjustment itself. So you can see it both ways. So whenever you want to change the tonality of your image, this is what you will do. So I'm going to undo all these changes we've just made by resetting that levels adjustment. And we come back to the original image. Let's say you don't want such dark areas in your image and you want to lighten them up. Then you have a second slider here in levels at the bottom. Okay. So by dragging the black point in, you will be lightening the blacks. Similarly, by moving the white point in, you will be darkening the whites. In other words, you're going to reduce the contrast. Look now at the histogram. There is no blacks, there's no whites. So you have only shades of gray. So you have this misty look which you have managed to get into the image. So I'm going to take it back. Let's take a look at a color image. Okay. So here we have the color image. Also note that if you go to the info panel here, whenever you point at a particular area, notice that it will give you the readout for that area. So for example, where I'm pointing right now is R206. That means quite bright. If I go to a dark area, see the value will change here. Okay. So very dark areas will come to almost 0. Okay. So 222 is really dark. And the bright areas comes to close to 255. Okay. So you can use the info panel to find out what is the tonal value or the tonal or what will be the value of that tone in the particular area of the image. As we said earlier, we could also use the lasso tool to just mark out an area and it would show us the contrast or the tonal area or the tonal range of that particular part of the image. Okay, so as you keep selecting areas, see the histogram will keep changing. So this image lacks a little bit of highlights of full white, as you can say. So if you can see on the right hand side, so if I use a level adjustment and bring in the white point, I get now full white here. And I could also bring in the black point to add more contrast to it. Okay, but it depends on your choice, on your preference basically for editing. Levels can also be used to add a kind of hazy effect to the image. So for example, we are currently working with the full tonal range and all colors in the image. So that's the RGB channel. So if you open the red channel, so this will only manipulate reds in the image. And as you can see, there's a lacking of highlights in the reds. So I can bring this in to improve the contrast of reds. I can do so with green as well and also with blue. So now if you look at the before after, notice that the image has become much more dynamic and better in contrast because we have gone and individually manipulated all the areas or all the channels, all the color channels in the image. You can add haze to this image. So for example, if I wanted to add an evening kind of glow to it, like an orangish glow, you could go to red and don't use the first slider because that's for the contrast of the image. The second slider will give you a lower contrast, in other words, a hazy image. So for example, if I bring in the black point for red, it will add a red haze. Okay, so notice it will give you a reddish haze. So I'm going to add a little red haze. The opposite, that is white, will give the opposite color of red. So in digital imaging, the opposite of red is cyan. So if you bring in the white point, you will get cyan haze being added to the image because that's the opposite of red. Similarly with green, if you want to add a green haze, you can bring in the black point. If you want the opposite of green, which is magenta, you can bring in the white point. Okay. And finally, for the blue channel, bringing in the black point will add blue haze to the image, and bringing in the white point will add yellow, which is the opposite of blue, to the image. So you can add a relative amount of yellow in this, go back to red and add a little more red. This will give you a kind of evening look to it. Okay. So adding haze to landscape pictures will make it a little softer and a little more easier to look at and more appealing. You can do the same things with curves. Okay. Now in curves, if you want to, I'm going to delete the levels layer so you can see what I'm doing. And go to the red channel and bring up the black point. So when you do that, it will add a red haze. And if you bring down the white point, then you will add cyan. So that's the only difference. Okay. So what happens if you do just the opposite? So you can get very fancy effects coming in if you try to do something like this. Okay. So I'm going to reset. So that's how you can use curves and levels to change the tonality of your image or also add or reduce the contrast of your image. So we've seen three adjustments here. One is the threshold adjustment, the other is the levels adjustment, and the third is the curves adjustment. Now you also have exposure where you can change the tonality of the image, but I avoid using the exposure adjustment primarily because, as you can see, there are gaps in the histogram, which means there is a loss of detail. So instead of using the exposure button, I prefer to use the curves and drag the midpoint of the curves up to either increase or decrease the amount of uh, exposure in the image. So the tonality of the image can also be changed with another adjustment, and that's called the gradient map. So basically you want to change the look of your image, okay, or the gradation of the tones in the image by applying a gradient map. So a gradient map simply says that where you have from black to white, you want to use two other alternate colors so that the image changes accordingly. So for example, when you click gradient map, you'll get a box coming up like this, and you click on the gradient map itself, and it will allow you to change those values. So there are some presets which are available. So for example, if you want to use a blue preset, you could use something like this. And since this is going from bright to dark, you've got the inverse. Okay, so you may want to either choose another one like this, dark to bright, or you could swap these buttons by moving them. I'm going to bring them back, and I want to go, let's say, from black. So I'll click on that color, click on color here and change it to black, and then I will bring this color. I want a lighter blue, so I'm going to choose a lighter blue color than what is currently there. And this is what I get in my image now. It has changed. It looks like a night scene, okay, just like that, and like a moonlit scene. And you have the tonality according to that. So if you want further changes to this, you could click on it, and then you could add a color. So we'll bring it down, and as you can see, by adjusting this, you can change the look of your image. So I click OK, and now this is before and this is after. So just like that, we've got kind of a night scene here. So this is another tool that you can use to change the tonality of your image. So why I say tonality? Because now here, instead of using pure black, I could use a shade of gray instead and change the way it looks. Yeah. So you could keep adding on to this. For example, you could go on here and then make changes accordingly to make sure that the image gets the look that you want. Okay. So looking at the histogram and working with your image is very important so that you get the right tonality in your image. Okay. So this is the basis of image processing or image editing. So it's very important that you understand these different tones, and once you do that, then you will be able to edit very freely and very fast.